Good morning again. I've been an aviculturist for, I think, close to 50 years. And I would say that I've had the privilege of getting into aviculture at a stage where many species were being brought into captivity for the first time. Veterinary science started developing incubators and hand-rearing formulas that were specifically geared towards parrots, evolved during my early years. So it allowed me to work and experiment and expand my knowledge. Today I want to share with you some of my findings, some of my mistakes, and some of the best lessons I've had. So when we look at parrot keeping, it dates back many centuries. But as we know it in modern times, it started in 1975. In the 1930s, a ornithologist from California began to look at surgical sexing, looking at the gonads of pheasants. But it really didn't jump into parrots until a surgeon, a doctor that became a veterinarian by the name of Raymond Cray said, we really need to know what sex these birds are, because he kept Amazons together for many years. They loved each other, they mated, but there were no eggs. So he began applying surgical sexing. And that revolutionized aviculture. It allowed us to look inside the birds to gauge its condition. Was it healthy? Was it not? What was its sex? What was its gender? And interestingly enough, when you look at many species and hundreds of thousands of birds, you realize that many of the birds, even the dimorphic ones, will never be able to breed because they have both genders. They're hermaphrodites. So about 3%, recent study in Australia said as high as 5%, but about 3% of the birds would be discarded. You would be wasting years and years, and nothing would happen. So 1975, it really started getting applied to aviculture, and now it is expanded worldwide. It's not only now used for surgical sexing, for identifying gender, but also for medical reasons. It allows us to go in there and remove parasites that may be floating around the body, to remove granulomas of aspergillosis, and to even take samples. Since the application of this technique, aviculture has jumped forward more than it had in the previous 200 years. Many species, as a result of surgical sexing, were bred for the first time. Marajo Island Amazons, blue-throated macaws, Eisman's conure, maroon-fronted parrot, yellow-shouldered Amazons, and on and on and on. The improvement has also focused on diet, on nesting boxes, and on husbandry. The British concept that we all inherited, aviculture really evolved in the UK. And then it expanded to Europe and the rest of the world. Of one square grandfather-type clock nest, it's obsolete. We know that that does not work for all species. And when you play with diet and the proper nest, and when you add components of surgical sexing, a new world has been opened. In fact, just very recently, in the past 2 years, we've seen the Tepui parrotlet, the little green bird on the left, and the saffron-headed parrots being bred in captivity. And that's only just 2 species that I am mentioning. And it's allowed the establishment of a lot of new mutations. Mutations are a thriving force of aviculture in many countries. In Asia, a bird that is yellow represents wealth. A bird that is red represents health, life. So many of these mutations find a huge market, particularly in the Asian market. Parrots are complex creatures. We know that they are individuals. They have very particular needs. They have a great memory. and they are very picky. We know that the concept that parrots mated for life and that you had to keep them together for life is flawed. Research from the wild and from captivity suggests that just like humans, they divorce. They get to a point that they say, I don't want to live with that one anymore. I want a new mate. So when you flock birds after the breeding season, you often find that the previous mate is rejected, and they may reject them forever or for a short period of time. And there's a lot of work that backs this principle up, done by Ian Rowley on the Gala in Western Australia. We also now know that one diet does not fit all species. As Professor Petra showed, they have different needs and different requirements. We understand that the need for protein exists. Here you see a gang cockatoo eating a rodent. But we also now understand that perhaps some of these super rich, sweet fruits that are cultivated are not a good component. Obesity is a huge problem in many birds now because we're feeding richer and richer foods, higher in fat, but it also impacts breeding. That particular Amazon there, I had been in Argentina taking chicks out of the nest, taking crop contents and putting them back so that I could figure out what percentage of protein, what percentage of fats did these birds need. And that particular bird was seen flying overhead one day, and I told my tree climbers, I said, geez, that bird looks different. I'll catch it for you. And he did. I got it, and I sent it to George Smith in the UK. I've never been a fan of mutations. Eventually, the bird came back to the US, and Howard Warren had it. And Howard had been traveling, and he said, can you go look? And when I went and looked, the bird did not walk. It rolled across the cage. So he said, why isn't it breeding? I said, it's a bag of fat. So obesity is a huge common component in infertility. Remember, they mate and they defecate through the same opening. And when they get fat, it builds up here. It builds up above the vent. We also know that high keratin is very important for many species, particularly some of the Indonesian Eclectus and Tanagnathus parrots. We also know that gender can be influenced by diet. In the US, we had a very small gene pool of blue-throated conures, and the problem was that 70% of the offspring were males. We had to change that. So what we started to do was play games with the diet. We would feed them a rich diet to induce breeding. The minute the first egg was laid, we dropped the fat, we dropped the protein as much as we could, and suddenly we began to produce females. When we boosted the fat and we boosted the protein, we produced males. Why did we want females? Because the gene pool was so small, the number of birds were so small, we needed to have multiple pairs. So when we played with the diet, we were able to balance the gender. Rather than having it skewed, we brought it back to balance. Poor diet, as I said, produces more females. An enriched diet produces more males. Why? When the forest is full of food, when food is so bountiful, you want males that will be dominant, that will challenge each other, that will produce the next generation of robust, strong, vigorous birds. But when the survival of the species is at stake, you need females. Food drops, quality drops. If you don't have females, the species dies. We also know that foods that are very rich in sugars can alter plumage color, but can also impact health. In my collection, and I've been working with cockatoos since 1980, I've kept track of incidences of mate aggression. And mate aggression is a huge problem, particularly in white cockatoos. We know that birds females that are killed or injured, almost invariably have some bacterial issue in the background. But we also know that when we give fruit to the cockatoos, the hyperactivity heightens the aggression, and we lose more females. So sugars in the diet are a huge problem. And why do I say this? Parrots have not evolved to eat the commercial fruits that we buy at the grocery store. They've evolved to compete with very few animals. They consume fruits green at a stage where sugars are very low, so they don't compete with bats, with hornbills, with anything else. They've cleared the slate of the competition. When you look at the fruits they eat, the sugar content is low, and it's astringent, and it's nasty. And nothing hit home more than once I was in Russia, and I saw a wild apple tree, and I plucked one, and I popped it in my mouth, and it was as bitter as a green olive plucked from a tree. It taught me that day that the macaws and the parrots that I was seeing, the Amazons that were raiding banana plantations in Central America, were always eating the green fruit. They would never eat the ripe fruit at the bottom. That was just a reaffirmation that ripe, sweet fruits should be avoided. Including, and this is one of the reasons, this is a very common case. I've been working on a cockatoo book now for many years. I hope to finish it before I die. I tend to overkill things. And incidents after incidents, when we look at the diets, sugar is a component. And it's not just in cockatoos. We see this in hawk-headed parrots and in Amazons. Many steps can be taken to control aggression. Obviously, you reduce sugars because you want to reduce that hyperactivity. You clip one wing on the male cockatoo. Every week, every single week, I get a message from someone in India and in Pakistan saying, my male cockatoo injured my female. He killed the female. What are you doing about it? Well, they've got a standard nest. No, you use a T-shaped nest or a U-shaped nest to allow the female to escape. You clip the male's wings. You create barriers, baffled, so that he can get away from her, or she can get away from him. And you create conditions to reduce aggression, not heighten aggression. In many cases, you require some modifications to habitat. One of the photos here, the one on your left, shows at Laurel Park. It's the creation of baffles so that a female that's being chased from the male can get out of sight. Remember the saying, out of sight, out of mind. And then in a facility in India that I provided a lot of consulting work for a number of years, they were having aggression. So what we did is we blocked the area of the nest. We did not block the entire cage because we wanted males to challenge each other, but not necessarily around the nest, because when they were challenging each other around the nest, the female would peek her head out, he would chase her in. And in his chasing her in, when she didn't oblige, he would go in and attack her. Or you devise contraptions that are very unique. Eclectus females are dominant. Eclectus that have been hand-reared and reared as pets are difficult to get back into breeding because the females tend to be very nasty. So what do? You create a series of cages that are connected with a tunnel. You can see the tunnel up above. And it allows multiple males to circulate. They can get out of her mind, out of her sight, and only come around when she's receptive. And they announce when they're receptive, when they want a male around, by changing their vocalizations. The T-shaped nest that I mentioned allows the female to escape a male. The concept of a standard box, square or grandfather type, as you see here, is in the past. When we look at how different species nests, it's never in a straight log or a palm tree. It goes all across the field, and I'll show you an example. I also hear that metal nest boxes overheat, that they're worthless, that birds won't use them. Well, I'll tell you what, they even use them in the wild. This is a wild Mexican redhead, Amazona viridinalis, in California. There was a dead palm tree, and a metal nest box was attached. They accepted it. The concept that metal nest boxes overheat was proven wrong. As long as you put some wood inside, it has the same thermal regulating capabilities as a standard wooden nest. And it's not just in captivity. Look at the wild birds. Plastic nest boxes are a new opportunity. They're being developed in South Africa. They're being sold. The advantage is that they're easily assembled and they're easily disinfected. And the disinfection process is very important because of circovirus, beak and feather disease, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. And when it comes to nest, apply observations from the wild. I was probably the first person in the U.S. to get St. Thomas conures. And I went to the island, and the island is a U.S. possession, and it allowed you to take the birds out. Nobody was trapping them, nobody was catching them, and we wanted to see how they were nesting. Well, they would invariably select a termite nest in a tree, but it had to have a protecting stick. And when we cut open all these termite nests, it was always an inverted C, a laying C. They would open a hole, tunnel up around, and then a nesting chamber. So I got these birds, and they wouldn't nest. They just would not. I said, you know what? I need to go back to the beginning. I need to look at what they were using and apply it. So we used this type of nest. Instantly, they started to breed. And not only the St. Thomas conures, but all of the other conures that were coming out of the wild that were also termite nesters. We need to also understand that birds have different likes. In 1980, I was very fortunate to have met a reverend by the name of Ramon Nogel. And Ramon Nogel was a unique character. I landed in Tampa, and he picked me up, and he said, tonight we have church. I expected a traditional church. It was a spiritualist church where he was a medium, and spirits would talk to their parishioners, and they would tell them, Maggie, give us more money. The Reverend needs more birds. So after seeing that, I thought, damn, where did I come? These people are crazy. I called my grandfather and said, Grandpa, can you get me a ticket back? He said, why? He said, things are crazy here. He said, give it a chance, give it a chance, give it another day. So the next morning I get up, and he's got this gruel that he's prepared of cheese and wheat germ, and he says, I'm going to go feed my birds. And Ramon at the time was the most successful breeder of Amazon parrots. So we're giving the food out, and he says, you know, if you want to learn to breed these birds, you better listen to them when they talk to you. I thought, oh, shit, this guy's really lost it. So I said, okay, I'm not going to call home again to get back. I'll wait it out. 4 days later, I leave, and I get home, and I'm talking to my grandfather, and he says, I said, you know, I've seen some incredible birds. He's breeding a lot of birds, but he talks to the dead, and he talks to the birds, and he says they talk to him. And he said, wait a minute, maybe you're looking at things too figuratively. Look at them from an angle. Perhaps what he's telling you is that the birds behave in a way that they communicate. They teach you things. And you know what? In retrospect, it was the best lesson possible. This particular scarlet macaw at my home, she never liked any of the nest boxes. It didn't matter whether it was square, whether it was any shape, metal, wood, but she always sat in one corner. And she would look at me and sit in the corner. So one day, one of my caretakers said, you know, that bird laid an egg in the corner. Okay, I go there. Sure enough. I said, okay, I'm going to give it a chicken nest box. And she began to use it right away. And I've had many macaws nest on the ground, some in chicken nest boxes, some directly on the soil. Here you see a pair of blue and golds with 2 chicks. In this case, it's a collection that Dr. Stacy manages, and they decided, hey, we didn't like the nest box. We wanted to breed, and we wanted to breed where we wanted to breed. So listen to them, pay attention. They will, with their actions, teach you a lot about their needs. Nest boxes, we have feral populations, wild populations of mitrid and blue-crowned conures in Miami. And there are thousands of these birds. Trappers would take some because they're a foreign species. They're considered vermin. And we all bought them because we wanted to breed them. So they wouldn't nest. It turned out that they were nesting in people's homes by using air ducts in the roof. They would break a hole in the air duct, climb in, and lay their eggs right on the air duct. Because it gets so hot in a roof that the chicks would die and the eggs would cook. So I said, okay, I'm going to try this. And we did. We offered a nest box with the entrance from the bottom, and bingo. They immediately started to nest. It was watching the birds, listening to what they needed, and providing it. I mentioned U, but there's also Y-shaped nest boxes. What's the advantage of the U-shaped nest? It gives the female more time to escape from a crazy male. In a T-shaped, the span to be able to get out is shorter than in a U-shaped nest. Porch entrances are liked by many African parrots because they nest in cavities that have a branch or something that they get in. And then for egg breakers, there's many reasons why they break eggs. They may break them because the male wants to mate with the female, because he's bored, because they're fighting, etc. With many birds, if you just take the nest and make it much deeper and create baffles, you will solve a problem. Why? Because he's going to look in and he's going to see wood. He's not going to see the female. If he sees the female, he'll go in, chase her out so he can mate. This was the solution to breaking egg-eating and egg-breaking habits in the blue-throated conures. Our population in the U.S., 80% of the pairs broke their eggs. We started to produce birds that had no habit, and we started with this. And then for persistent egg breakers like cockatoos, we use this type of nest where the egg rolls out of place. And it rolls out of place into a compartment that is full of soft shavings. It has to be deep enough because if not, they'll try to reach in and grab the egg. And then for Brotogeris parakeets, they nest in termites. They go through multiple compartments. If you look at a termite nest that Brotogeris parakeets have nested, so it's a big circle, and then if you break it, if you cut it open, it's a circle, a line, a circle, a line, a circle. They tunnel in, they break a chamber, they create a second chamber, and then they create a third chamber. And this didn't make any sense to me until I'm in Puerto Rico and we are looking at termite nests. And they were harvesting chicks. And as they were harvesting chicks, once a termite has been tunneled, it dies. So I said, it was a great opportunity. Let's take the termites down. Let me look. And they were taking the chicks because the law allowed them to be collected and they would export them to pet stores in the U.S. In 2 nests, we found boas. And the boas were always in the first 2 chambers. They never penetrated the 3rd chamber, which is where the birds were nesting. So they were basically creating a stop for the snakes to eat their babies or eggs. Dr. Susan Clubb is a vet that was probably one of the originators in the U.S. And I remember at a time, at a heyday of bird imports, 1978, I went and bought 20 blue and golds. They were $195 each. That gives you an idea of the magnitude of the trade. And we had them all sexed, and I picked up pairs. I gave pairs a standard nest with shavings, and I gave the other pairs a nest filled to the brim with chunks of wood. And we scoped these birds regularly. We found that those that had a standard nest took forever to become sexually active. Those that had to spend time in the nest chewing and working, the gonads exploded and they became reproductively active much sooner. So in the wild, nobody gives them shavings. They have to prepare the nest. Give them chunks of wood. Force them to spend time in the nest, because that will induce the gonads to explode, and that will encourage breeding. I often hear that I can't check the nest because they break the eggs. Listen, birds get into habit. Humans are habit-forming people. I do the same thing every day before I go to bed, and I do the same thing every day when I wake up, and my birds basically do the same. So what do? I check the nest box. I have the nest boxes checked every day. They get used to it. They're just as curious about me as we are about them. If we check the nest every day, they're not going to go crazy when you open the nest and they have an egg or a chick. Flying pairs together, as I said, is very important because it allows them to repair, select a new partner. And it's very easy to watch pair formation. They immediately separate and they begin to show aggression. Hand rearing, as we know it today, dates back centuries. In the Archive of Indies in Seville, Spain, there are manuscripts from the area of discovery. And they talk about people chewing food and giving it to baby parrots to raise them. If we go back even further back, around 300 BC, Alexander the Great crossed the Hindu Kush and entered India. And Aristotle, who wrote much of his memories, mentioned how they would take baby parrots and feed them and raise them to become tame. In fact, those birds that were brought back were the first parrots seen in Europe. So hand rearing has been practiced for a long time by native people, but it was really the 1960s that it jumped into aviculture. And it started with a group of Californians, Velma Hart, Ken Wyatt, and some of these other individuals that wanted to boost production. Australia in 1957, close to exports, they were breeding Rosellas, which did very well in the dry climate of California, but they wanted to produce more because there was a huge market. So they started experimenting with hand rearing. Early hand rearing formulas included things like cognac and cornmeal. And I asked Velma Hart, she was very old when I met her, and I said, "Why did you add cognac?" She said, "To keep the babies warm." So there's been a huge evolution. Obviously, we don't add alcohol to current formulas, but hand rearing as we know it today really started in the 1960s. It's an important tool that can significantly increase results, but it can also be a problem. We could produce birds that are imprinted, or that suddenly we're mixing birds from multiple nests, and we can contaminate them. So in my home, every incubator has its own cup, and each has its own feeding instruments. We don't dip from one to the next brooder to brooder. We try to keep isolation as much as possible. In fact, one of the biggest problems that I have with many incubators and many brooders is disinfection. We need to be able to get into the motors. We need to be able to take them apart and clean them, because many diseases proliferate in a warm, hot, humid, perfect environment. Poor airflow, high humidity from the feces of the babies, and it's enclosed and hot. So incubators not only incubate baby birds, and brooders not only brood baby birds, but they also can be a source of bacterial infection. Learn proper formula manufacturing and preparation. Read instructions. Not all formulas have to be prepared the same. Some require greater heating than others. Read. If you don't, then you're going to end up with wallpaper, glue for wallpaper, or you're going to end up with a mix that's like cement. Ensure the correct temperature. Cold formula can be fed to babies as long as you rear them from day one through independence. You cannot get them used to warm formula and suddenly give them cold formula. Obviously, you want to get as close to body temperature as possible, so 40 degrees is the optimum temperature. Use a digital thermometer. Everyone, we are in a modern age where contraptions of all kinds give us huge amounts of knowledge. Use an electronic thermometer. Stir, and you get a surface reading. But when you stir, you're making the temperature equal, and you're getting an accurate reading. You just don't dump everything and take a surface, because the surface will always be cooler. You want to make sure you mix, you blend the formula. And understand that fat is very, very important. Let me take one pause. There are dozens of formulas on the market. And formula manufacture is basically based on chicken research. It's not parrot research. Nobody bothered doing research as to how much food they required, how much fat, how much protein. It's chicken research applied. So some of the formulas have very low fat. And one of the things I learned when I spent 3 separate years, 3 months each year during the breeding season in Argentina, was that the flowering of fatty foods is what triggered breeding. In Puerto Rico, the Puerto Rican Amazon links its nesting to the fruiting of the Sierra palm. When the Sierra palm doesn't fruit, the birds hold breeding. When it fruits, they breed prolifically because it's fatty. So if we don't provide enough fat, they don't do well, and that carries over into reproduction. Here's, for example, a chick, 2 kikes, white-bellied kikes. One's fed 21% fat, one's fed 10% fat. I don't need to tell you which one is which. When you hand rear from day one, you feed them throughout the day. This concept that you give Pedialyte, that you let them defecate the first, it doesn't apply to nature. Every parrot nest that I have climbed to look at, the minute the chicks hatch, they're fed. They don't give them water. They don't wait for them to defecate. They begin to feed them immediately. And when you look at food and fat and the frequency of feedings, you may say, oh, well, at the end they catch up. Yes, they catch up, but it will impact reproduction. Almost 4 years ago, I kept back a large group of dusky conures. And we fed some a low-fat diet and some a high-fat diet. Some were fed in the low-fat diet birds. We waited for them to defecate before we began to feed them. The other ones we hand-fed from hatching. The ones that were high-fat started to breed at an average of 11 months. Those that were fed low-fat began to breed at 15, and most of them did not breed until 18 months. What does that tell us? That we didn't meet the early growth requirements of the individual birds. We keep the crop full every day. When I hear that, oh, if I feed them and I keep the crop full all day, they develop crop stasis, a slowed crop. That's a husbandry problem. That's telling me that there's something going on and not the formula. Because you know what? The parents keep their crops full all day. In the wild, they keep their crops full all day. We weigh chicks regularly to determine how well they're doing. We have a database built over many years. It gives me a range so that I can go back and look and say, is this chick within this range or is it below this range? We keep them warm. Chilling causes them to either die if they're very young or it slows crop. And we try to avoid chemicals that can be harmful. When we have a chick born with a unabsorbed yolk, we don't use betadine. We don't use any cream. We apply plain old white cane sugar. And I learned this from a friend of my father who had been a doctor in the Panama Canal. And he said, you know what we found works the best for wounds was plain sugar. It's bleached so it disinfects. And the sugar encourages healing. We find that it works really well. And you could see a before and an after. The before, we applied cane sugar, we tied it off. We didn't sever it off. Immediately, the area dried, and we didn't have to do surgery. We didn't have to do anything complex. That only ended up stressing the chick. And that's what we had done. So, you see it? And the same chick, 7 days later. Keep chicks warm. Keep them dark. At present, I have my collection in Florida, and I'm involved with a very special project. We produce thousands of birds. We find that when we keep them dark, the growth grows exponentially higher than when they're kept exposed. It's very important. And it makes sense because in the nest, they're kept dark. They're dark. Parrots don't breed out in the open. They're nesting in a dark cavity. Kikes are very important here and across Asia because they're in big demand, especially the white-bellied kikes, because again, we've got yellow, represents wealth. So they're also very difficult to hand rear from day one. And at one point, I think Eric and some of the other U.S. aviculturists are exporting to Taiwan, and they wanted white-bellied kikes, and they also wanted them without much black in the head, so they were selective. But the market exploded for these birds. And, I have a payroll in Miami that just in salaries for my caretakers is $150,000 a year. And I don't have that many birds. I have 200 pairs of birds. So I said, this is going to be a bonanza here. We've got 20 pair of kikes. I'm going to set them all up to breed. And we began to breed and kill the babies as fast as they hatched. So I put a camera in the nursery, and I said, I want to know what's happening. We would feed them, and then we would just see them dead. I looked at the camera, and you could see the baby birds getting fed, and then at a certain point, they would start pumping, and flip on their backs. They would aspirate and die. The solution was so simple. We took coffee cups, put some tissue in there, kept them penguin upright for 5 to 7 days. Problem was resolved. We didn't lose any kikes. But understand that these idiosyncratic, these natural behaviors, you need to be able to recognize them. You don't have a room full of baby macaws that's pitch dark and suddenly come in and flip on a light because they're going to get startled and flip on their backs. Keep a night light in the nursery. I know I said you want to keep them dark. Yes, it's dark, but you want to be able to let certain species that tend to flip on their backs when they're startled, macaws, from doing that. So you try to have multiple rooms wherever possible. Vomiting is a very common reaction in baby kikes. The first feeding, they vomit a little bit. So what we do is we feed them less, the first feeding, and then we go back up the continuing feedings. Maintain strict hygiene. I had been asked to go to Brunei to look at a very special collection, and they were losing baby birds like crazy. This is how the brooders were kept. They were basically growing bacteria. and not the birds. Hygiene is very important. I cannot stress it enough. Airflow and hygiene are your best friends. And then there are many diseases that are species specific. Megabacteria, gastric yeast, and cockatiels. And how do we test? Hydrogen peroxide. You dab it in the mouth. If it begins to foam, then it's a problem. But if it's a problem, you better be prepared to clean it out because that baby can aspirate. So gastric bacteria is a huge problem with cockatiels. You don't want to be hand-rearing cockatiels in the same room as you are some macaws or Amazons or cockatoos. Yeast. We now make it a point of using gentian violet in the water for hand-rearing. We make it blue, and we use that 5 days out of the week. Problem resolved. We don't have to use fluconazole, voriconazole, nystatin, or anything else. Gentian violet is a dye. It's a coloring agent, and it suffocates the yeast. Pseudomonas are far more common in aviculture than we think, and it tends to cause the next twist. Unfortunately, it's injectable antibiotics that really work well, and we've injected chicks as early as 3 days of age under the skin twice a day. Clostridium has long been, I think, not recognized. It's a greater problem than we see, and it basically causes the abdominal area to swell because the chick can't defecate. So you use both metronidazole, and the dose will vary depending on individuals from 500 milligrams a liter to or 2,000 per gallon to as little as 100 milligrams per liter. And the standard now in a large industrial production is you use it for 5 days every other week. And this is one case where it causes the bloating, but in cockatoos, they tend to turn white because there's blood loss. Toe-constricting syndrome, no one really knows whether it's viral or whether it's temperature and cost. I think it has to do with humidity, so it's something that we look at. When we have splayed legs, they're telling me I have to rush. The best is to use a sponge, because when you tie them, the chicks tend to wobble. A sponge provides the support where they can balance. When you have prognathism, one of the best ways is you use a piece of straw and crazy glue, and you do this, and in a period of 2 days, you have the solution. The other alternative is you tape the beak shut at night in position using duct tape, a very strong tape. When you feed macaws, the beaks tend to deviate if you feed from one side or if you don't give enough fat. When you don't give enough fat, they grab the side of the bowl and begin to pump and pump and pump and pump because they're hungry. But they pump from the side. So it forces the beaks to deviate. Make sure you have enough fat, and make sure that when you feed, you align the beaks. It's very simple. You just use this procedure with your hand. You push the bottom beak to one side, the top one to the opposite side, so they're balanced. This is one solution for macaws. You keep them in a deep tub that they can't grab the edge. The best for crop stasis or a stop crop, in my opinion, is papaya seeds. I called it papaya cream. I think it's now widely used worldwide. And it's basically papaya seeds with a little bit of papaya, a little bit of Pedialyte, and you give this to the chick as its sole food until the crop begins to move. In 80% of the cases, it will resolve it. If you're planning on keeping the chicks for future breeders, rear them together. Imprinted birds carry problems. Make sure that you rear them as birds. They are not a feathered human. They're not an extension of your body. They're not your children. I hate this word of fibs. Feathered children, feathered kids. Come on, they are a bird. They're not a human with feathers. When you raise them like humans with feathers, they develop mental issues. They fight, they kill each other. They don't reproduce. Make sure that they understand they're birds. They play with each other. They interact with each other. They learn enrichment. And contrary to many claims that hand-reared birds will not breed, they will breed if you rear them right. These are some galas at my home. 3 generations, hand-reared. They have no problem rearing their young. Always observe, because you never know what you're going to find. And understand the risks of diseases. And I know I've run out of time, but I want to touch on something very important. So, PDD is a worldwide problem. Many birds are dying from this every year. There is really no known treatment. There's lots of things. We don't even know how well it's transmitted. And with PDD, I'm referring to Bornavirus, proventricular disease, dilatation disease as one, because otherwise I'll be repeating the same words over. It is a huge problem. The tests are not very reliable. I took some samples from a museum skin that was going to get burned. It had decomposed, and I sent it to 3 labs. The skin had been collected in the 1800s. It had sat in formaldehyde and arsenic for 100 years, and yet the labs found Bornavirus. Do I really believe it? No. The virus is supposed to die. What we know about the particular virus is it dies very quickly in the environment. How could it have survived through formaldehyde, arsenic, in 100 years? It just shows that the testing techniques are highly flawed. Papillomas are highly contagious. They are a very common component in macaws that you are still receiving in the Middle East and in Asia from Guyana and Suriname. It can be treated, and the treatment is very simple. Here's before and after. You put the birds on hot peppers every day, but it's for their life. It does not cure. It basically sends it into remission. You can hatch healthy chicks from those eggs, but you must take, from those pairs, but you must take the eggs out and disinfect them. And the best means of disinfection is hydrogen peroxide. And I don't know here, but barbers in the US have a little UV unit that you put your combs in to disinfect. You buy one of those, you put your eggs in there for 5 minutes, and then you incubate them. You will be able to hatch papilloma-free chicks from papilloma-infected birds that you are keeping on hot peppers, because if you don't, you will lose the birds. Circle virus is an explosion. It is the subject of a lot of discussion recently over the Spix's macaws in Brazil. It is a grave concern. I believe that there are 2 types running around aviculture. There is a standard Australian strain that we've all been dealing with for decades. And basically, it impacted chicks in the nest before the Bursa fabricius sealed, and then they would die. The newer strain that is around is impacting adult birds. And I know this for a fact because I've known these 2 birds in these photos. I knew for many years. I had taken care of them. Several other people had taken care of them. Suddenly they come in contact with some Asiatic parakeets and some lorikeets. The birds develop full-blown circle virus. They were tested, and the sequencing for the traditional strain did not match the sequence that they have there. And there's a paper that's being worked on. So there are 2 strains going around aviculture. Please test, and test. Some of the birds will test positive and then 2 negatives. 1 positive does not mean you destroy the birds. It does not mean you go crazy. It basically means that you isolate that particular bird and you test it again. And you test it again. You don't react by killing a bird with the first test, but you definitely do not take that for granted. You must test, and you must do so multiple times. Now, we know the feathers pinch. There have been attempts at vaccines in South Africa, and the vaccines, part of the problem is the vaccines work for the traditional strain, not for the newer strains making their rounds in aviculture. And then there is a product sold in Europe called Silexis. It is an antiviral for sheep. It holds a lot of promise, but what we do not know is how many injections must we give to get the birds to go into remission, and will that remission last? There are birds that I've been testing it on because Natalie from Belgium alerted me of this, and it seems to work in some birds after multiple injections, and then they're fine. Some of them may become fine and then revert again, and some of them may not. The efficacy of this Silexis is still unknown, but at least it's giving us some new opportunities and some new hope, because I will tell you, this is a huge, huge problem. It is now impacting adult birds. It never did that. Polyoma is a particular problem in Asia and in the US. Basically, the chicks bleed to death. There is a vaccine available. The problem with the vaccine is that it's not widely sold because it must be transported cold chain. When you use the vaccine in kikes, the first vaccine, you must give Baytril. If you don't, many of them will die. We don't know why. This was a concept that was started many years ago in Florida, that was developed by Susan Clubb and Don Harris. And I found out we would vaccinate all the chicks that we sold, that if we did not give Baytril, we would lose some of the kikes. You culture non-producing pairs. You just don't start giving antibiotics. Everybody tells me, can you give me what antibiotic I can give to my birds to make them breed? Come on. You medicate with knowledge. You don't use antibiotics recklessly. There are now, and Stacy will laugh and confirm this, there are now many birds that are resistant to every drug on the market. The disease is just nothing affects them because everybody's used antibiotics. Oh, we try Baytril. We try Cipro. We try this one, that one, nitrofurantoin. You need to do cultures. You need to understand what you're targeting. It's not just giving them any antibiotic. I know I've taken too much time. I apologize for having extended. If you have any questions, please feel free to grab me and ask any questions you may have. Again, I thank you for coming. There are people here from many countries. It shows where aviculture is going. It is expanding, particularly in the Middle East and Asia, with all these young faces. And if you've not registered to go to the Laurel Park Conference, do so. You will see an incredible collection, and you will meet many, many people that think the same way you do. If you do, I'll see you there next year. Thank you.